The number of countries offended by the Trump administration's pronouncements keeps growing. Add Germany to the list. The issue there is election interference, its effect on the far right. It's a similar story in Ukraine.
Zelenskyy better move fast or he's not going to have a country left.
Where media outlets are in shock over what Trump is saying about the war, while news channels in Moscow are celebrating.
Какая-то весна невозможная, моментально наступившая.
And populism Salvadorian style. The Bukele government gets re-elected, and journalists are nervous. Germans vote in a national election this Sunday, February 23rd, one in which their political system is being put to the test. The polls have a far-right party, Alternative for Germany, or AfD, sitting in second place. Once considered a pariah organization, an apologist for the country's Nazi past, the AfD is now at around 20% of the vote. Germany's mainstream parties have long shunned the AfD through the building of a so-called firewall, refusing to include the party in the coalition building that is so central to politics there. This is where the Trump administration comes in, a case of outside interference. The U.S. Vice President, J.D. Vance, has taken aim at that firewall, saying the time has come to take it down. And Elon Musk has been boosting the AfD on X and backing it in a German newspaper. At the heart of this debate, the question, does engaging with extremist views risk legitimizing them? And as if German voters don't have enough to think about, there's another international player in the mix, Russia. Its contribution consists of disinformation, fake news. Barely 2 months after taking power, the Trump administration has turned its modus operandi, planting the seeds of chaos in a democracy into an American export.
Amerikas Vizepräsident hält eine anti-europäische Rede gepaart mit Verachtung. Nachkriegsordnung AD drängen.
Vice President J.D. Vance went to Germany 1 week before a national election there and scolded its leaders for erecting a political firewall between their parties and the far-right Alternative for Germany party, and refusing to consider sharing power with the AfD. He said that in the country where the World War II Holocaust got its start. And Vance refused to meet with the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz. Instead, he got together behind closed doors with the AfD's leader, Alice Weidel. Weidel has described Germany's memorialization of the Holocaust as a guilt cult, and recently rebranded the architect of that genocide.
Ich bin Ökonomin und für uns ist völlig klar, dass Adolf Hitler ein Linker war. Und ich habe in dem Interview gesagt,
J.D. Vance was representing the new face of U.S. diplomacy, interfering in the politics of America's biggest, most important European ally.
Das gehört sich nicht. Erst recht nicht unter Freunden und Verbündeten. Das weisen wir entschieden zurück.
The idea of the second Trump administration is to run into a room, throw a couple of stink bombs, shout and yell, this place is a mess, and then while everyone is still wondering what's happening, your gang comes in, actually smashes all the windows and says, okay, we're in control of this place.
It's unheard of. It's simply unheard of for a US vice president to interfere in German elections. This speech was clearly timed to make an impression on voters in Germany. There's no other way of explaining that a US vice president would call for a breakdown of the firewall towards the right just over a week ahead of elections in Europe's biggest country.
The rise of populism is not unique to Germany. Given the country's history, however, the risk of it repeating itself, the implications are scarier there than in other democracies.
ein Tabubruch, sicher, aber auch das Ende der sogenannten Brandmauer.
The German word for their political firewall is Brandmauer. Politicians built it in the aftermath of World War II to guard against any possible resurgence of the far right. In a multi-party system ruled by coalitions, refusing to share power with the AfD effectively isolates the party politically. But that firewall is now being put to the test by the AfD and its new backers in Washington. including Donald Trump's in-house agent provocateur, Elon Musk. Musk has waded into the German media space, writing a pro-AfD op-ed for the newspaper Die Welt. Then he platformed Alice Weidel, interviewing her on X.
And people really need to get behind the AfD, and otherwise things are going to get very, very much worse in Germany.
Yes, because
But cracks in Germany's firewall predate this Trump administration.
The main shift was in 2015 when Angela Merkel, during the big refugee crisis in Europe, said, okay, we need to open the borders. Refugees from Syria were actually too much of a burden for neighboring countries, Hungary, Austria, and others. But that created the basis for the new AfD, a very anti-immigration party with very racist attitudes and also some of them anti-Semitic.
Brandmauer is a metaphor to define red lines that parties or politicians do not want to cross. If now a party is questioning the history of this country by turning the Holocaust experience and taking a relativist stance on everything that led to this, then this might be perfectly okay in countries with a different history. But in Germany, this is a line that a lot of people feel that shouldn't be crossed.
Well, it became quite clear that the Trump administration sees as its natural partners, not just in Germany, but also in Europe, which is shifting to the right, those right-wing populist parties. That explains why not just Elon Musk, but also US Vice President J.D. Vance threw their political weight behind the far-right AfD party in Germany that can safely be called direct election interference because it calls on Germans to vote for a particular party.
There's another angle to this story with implications that stretch across the European Union. J.D. Vance accused commissars working at the European Commission of having too much power, saying they can shut down social media during times of civil unrest over what they deem to be hateful content. The EU has been far more willing to regulate the technology sector than the US has. And Silicon Valley has been lobbying hard against legislation the EU passed in 2022, the Digital Services Act, or DSA, which requires tech platforms to stop the spread of illegal or dangerous content. The DSA is the EU's firewall against the dangers of big tech. No American administration would approve of it, and certainly not one with a tech bro apparently sharing a White House workspace with Donald Trump.
The European Union are currently investigating to what extent the Digital Service Act is ignored by the big media platforms from Silicon Valley, or even manipulating the algorithm to widen what Weidel is posting or what the AfD is doing. So there might be a lawsuit from the European Commission against platforms like Meta or X. But the bottom line of that speech is leave our big companies alone, and if you step on anyone's toes, and Musk in particular, we will give you a hard time.
J.D. Vance, before he came to Europe, had already made very clear that US defense commitment towards European partners is conditional upon non-regulation of the digital sphere here. The European Union already has regulation in place, and the big question now is whether this US administration will seek to and be successful at trying to stop that regulation from going ahead.
As for Germany, voters there also have to weather political interference blowing in from the east in the form of Russian disinformation, an operation known as Doppelganger. First detected in Germany in 2022, its work resurfaced last month. Doppelganger clones well-known German mainstream news sites by duplicating their look, layout, and style, and spreading it on social platforms like WhatsApp and Telegram. The US and Russia bring differing agendas to Germany, ranging from influencing politics there to destabilizing the government. But in both cases of outside interference, the beneficiary happens to be the same party, the AfD.
So where Russian outlets just mimic traditionally established big news outlets like Der Spiegel or Die Zeit and others, and add their own content to it. So therefore, for many readers, it looks like a traditional newspaper just covering or sharing the opinions you already share as someone who believes in maybe a party like the AfD, and all of a sudden you get a confirmed bias covered falsely by one of the major news outlets.
What is happening with social media and the algorithm's selection mechanism is that the opinion forms the people and not the people form an opinion. To flood them with either fake news or with stylized narratives that doesn't necessarily need to be wrong. But if someone starts looking into something painful, like this form of terrorist attacks or crimes, then you will get more and more information about it, and the general sentiment becomes Germany isn't safe anymore, even if the statistics tell you a different story.
It's been a rough week for Ukraine and President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Call it the Trump effect. It was on full display as the U.S. made clear where it stands on what Donald Trump calls a war that Ukraine started with Russia. Meenakshi Ravi has been tracking this story.
Donald Trump has never made any secret of A, his frustration at the role the United States has had to play in supporting Ukraine's war effort.
I will have the horrible war between Russia and Ukraine settled.
And B, his willingness to engage with Vladimir Putin in Russia.
I'll be dealing with President Putin largely on the phone.
This past week amounted to a political train wreck for Ukraine. In mid-February, Trump got on the phone with Putin and Zelenskyy individually. Within days, US and Russian officials met in the Saudi capital Riyadh to discuss how to end the war. Ukraine was not invited. Then came an unprecedented exchange of undiplomatic barbs between Trump and Zelenskyy.
He refuses to have elections, is low in the real Ukrainian polls.
Ми бачили цю дезінформацію. Ми розуміємо, що вона йде від Росії. На жаль, живе в цьому дезінформаційному просторі.
A dictator without elections. Zelenskyy better move fast or he's not going to have a country left.
Ukraine has been under martial law since the war began 3 years ago. Elections scheduled for early 2024 did not happen, due at least partly to safety concerns. While polls show Zelenskyy is not nearly as unpopular as Trump says he is, the war has eroded Ukrainian goodwill for the president. Ukrainian media outlets, which have been tightly controlled for 3 years now, are in a state of shock.
Важко прокоментувати це і щось додати. Знову ж таки наголошую, що ми ще не встигли оговтатися від попереднього, вже з'явилося нове.
In Russia, news anchors could not contain themselves.
Просто какая-то весна невозможная, моментально наступившая.
The fireworks over this past week also had European governments scrambling. One way or another, the war appears to be heading for a conclusion. And given what Ukraine has to lose in the way of territorial control, the outcome is unlikely to go down well in Kiev.
Thanks, Mina. A year ago this month, El Salvador held an election. Nayib Bukele and his party, Nuevas Ideas, won a landslide victory, 54 of the 60 congressional seats, cementing Bukele's grip on power. In his 6 years in office, the country has seen a dramatic drop in gang violence and homicides, thanks to some uncompromising policies and mass arrests. But that has come at a price. Constitutional rights have been suspended under an extended state of emergency, and journalists now face harassment, surveillance, and censorship. Despite concerns over a creeping form of authoritarianism, Bukele remains wildly popular among Salvadorians, bolstered by his savvy social media presence and a growing alliance with the American far right. The Listening Post's Elettra Scrivo now, with producer Julia Gavarete, on Nayib Bukele's Salvadorian brand of populism and its effect on press freedom there.
The day Salvadorian journalist Victor Barajona's life unraveled started with a knock on the door. It was the police.
As we were walking down the steps of my house, one of the officers handcuffed me and said, "You're under arrest under the provisions of the state of emergency." I was first taken to La Esperanza Mariona jail. There were 230 of us in a space fit for 70, 80 people max. It was down to basic survival there. They'd give us a single glass of water for the whole day. We'd drink half in the morning and half in the afternoon. We began falling ill. We'd get fungal infections, skin sores, boils, fever. I was then moved to a maximum security prison, Izalco, where we slept on the floor. The guards would punish us, call us rats or worse. They said we were going to die there.
Barajona's ordeal lasted almost a year. By the time he was released, the circumstances of his arrest were no clearer. He received no official release letter, and the police accusation against him remained unchanged: collaborating with gangs, also known as pandillas.
Look, my arrest was due to me being a journalist. There's no doubt about that. I hosted a TV show where we talk about the community's needs, lack of employment prospects, challenges with education, and access to public health resources.
¿Cuáles son las causas por qué los salvadoreños emigran? Se nos menciona el alto costo de la vida, el desempleo, la corrupción.
Entonces, esos programas que no le gustaban.
The government didn't like these kind of programs. We'd also discussed the state of emergency and the innocent people being taken away to prison. The state of emergency didn't just put a stop to the gangs. It was to neutralize us, the independent press.
El Salvador has a commissioner for human rights and freedom of speech, Andrés Guzmán. He denies Barajona's case had anything to do with his profession.
No es un caso de un seguimiento periodista por sus pensamientos o pronunciamientos.
This is not a case about a journalist and his statements or opinions. This man was never a political journalist. Even if he was, the fact that he is a journalist does not exempt him from having meddled with gangs. When someone is placed under arrest, this order is carried out by state prosecutors who have evidence of incontestable facts.
In reality, the evidence being used against Salvadorians is anything but incontestable. Since President Bukele's state of emergency was declared in 2022, El Salvador has had the highest rate of incarcerations in the world. Out of a population of roughly 6.5 million people, more than 80,000 are currently behind bars. Many are held without evidence, in degrading conditions, with no contact with the outside world. Journalists, especially community reporters who shine a light on social issues, have been subject to Bukele's iron fist, or mano dura. The sweeping crackdown on gangs has also led to the restriction of constitutional rights and press freedom. In 2024 alone, the Journalists Association of El Salvador recorded 467 attacks. These include arbitrary detentions, intimidation, phone tapping, and seizing of equipment.
It's not just the fact that we're under constant attack from the government. We also have no mechanism that protects our rights. Because here, the Supreme Court, the Constitutional Chamber, and the Legislative Assembly all answer to Nayib Bukele. So if journalists are faced with legal proceedings and appeal to the Supreme Court, for instance, we know what their response is going to be. They're going to turn their backs on us or laugh in our faces.
The situation has darkened substantially since 2022. All platforms of access to public information have been shut down. Journalists are operating in a void because the government's propaganda machine has engulfed television, radio, and social media. Those journalists who are committed to holding the powerful to account through their work are like salmon, constantly swimming upstream. Bukele sees us, the free press, as an obstacle to the absolute takeover of Salvadorians' minds.
There are no restrictions whatsoever in terms of freedom of the press. Quite the contrary. In the 2 years I have worked for the government of El Salvador, there wasn't a single journalist who has been arrested, nor a single smashed-up camera or news item that has been taken down from social media.
Commissioner Guzmán's assertions are not true, but that isn't surprising. They're part of Bukele's strategy of controlling the narrative, inside and outside El Salvador, rebranding the small, impoverished country into one of the safest countries in the world. How? By using a media and PR apparatus to whitewash controversial policies and a brutal crackdown on crime. And it's working. Bukele's approval rating is 91%. These kind of videos of El Salvador's biggest prison, the Terrorism Confinement Center, or CCOT, show the media machine at work. Slick and set to upbeat music, they became an instant sensation.
Estos peligrosos pandilleros no los pagarán en una cárcel común, sino en el centro de confinamiento del terrorismo.
Such videos reinforce Bukele's brand. He is what many critics call a millennial caudillo, a digitally fluent, at times irreverent, strongman.
Their strategy is effective because in addition to telling people we fixed your most pressing problem, it succeeded in sowing new fears among the public. Unless Nayib Bukele gets another 5 years, the gangs will be back out on the streets.
Y así, señor presidente, si hacemos una comparativa y recordamos un poco de la historia, en los gobiernos anteriores, como en Arena y el FMLN le habían entregado los penales a todos esos grupos terroristas.
Their carefully curated messaging and propaganda helps them sell whatever anti-constitutional decisions they take very effectively. Bukele took the fight against criminal insecurity and made it cool, an issue as delicate as the safety of citizens has turned into showbiz.
It was all just a show, a very different prison. I'd like a video showing Isalco prison, where many people have died, where I almost died. Actually interviewing inmates, asking what they've gone through. But they won't do that. They make videos that are acceptable for an international audience.
An audience in which Donald Trump has a front row seat. The US president made sure to remind Bukele of that when he sent his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, on a visit this month. Not that Bukele needed much reminding. He was closing up to the American right far before Trump was re-elected. Even Trump's cutting of foreign aid to El Salvador plays to Bukele's advantage, since some of those American dollars helped keep independent media outlets, critical of the government, in business. And Bukele is offering Trump a quid pro quo in the form of CCOT. He's willing to make room at his mega prison for American criminals, so he and Trump can be tough on crime together.
Right now, President Bukele has better access and more sway than ever with Washington, which is promoting the suppression of civil rights, along with the persecution of journalists and human rights advocates. In spite of this, and the current funding crisis in the media sector, we have seen a new crop of very brave journalists who are shining a light on the murky, corrupt ways in which this government is using its power.
They won't keep us quiet. Journalists have a commitment not to governments, mayors, ministers, or bankers of this country, but with those who need our reporting the most. If I or a colleague dies, someone else will take our place. If they shut down a channel today, we'll just do it from someone's living room with a phone tomorrow. But we will carry on reporting.
And finally, back to Germany. With most news stories like this week's elections, the media there produce pretty robust journalism. Tough questions get asked, power is held to account, which is why the coverage of Israel's war on Gaza stands out the way it has. German news outlets dare not criticize Israel for its war crimes against Palestinians, and they seem to have no issue with the crackdowns on anti-Zionist protesters and free speech. Francesca Albanese is the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories, and she can speak to those crackdowns.
I'm pretty shocked for the controversy that this event has stirred. It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever and makes me really scared for where Germany is.
This past week, Albanese was invited to speak in Berlin and Munich. One event was forced to change venues due to pressure from politicians and police. 2 other talks at universities were canceled for security reasons. Francesca Albanese knows the historical context here, German guilt over the World War II Holocaust. But Germany is also second only to the U.S. in arms exports to Israel. So its role in this genocide ranges from complicity to enabling. And its media outlets have completely caved in to the political pressures at play, to the point where Germans are more likely to get the real story by scrolling through their phones rather than turning on their televisions.